All right, good afternoon. My name is Annette Anderson, and I am a faculty member in the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University, and I also serve as the Deputy Director for the Center for Safe and Healthy Schools at Hopkins. I'm also one of the team leads of the eSchool Plus initiative, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon's discussion. I would like to thank you for joining our webinar series, Equity in K-12 School Reopening. Today, we will be talking about the following topic: how to best support students with special education needs. We see this as a critical conversation because we know that according to the National Center for Education Statistics, in 2018-2019, approximately 7.1 million, or 14%, of the children in our public schools receive services under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. For many of them, school closures last spring presented particular challenges. As we prepare to return to school next fall, we look forward to thinking about how we can expand opportunities for all of our students with disabilities. Before we begin this afternoon's discussion, I would like to extend a very special thank you to our seminar sponsors, including the Johns Hopkins School of Education, the Johns Hopkins Consortium for School-Based Health Solutions, the Berman Institute of Bioethics, and the Rail Center for the Integration of Health and Education. Our format today will consist of 3 brief presentations from each of our panelists, followed by a discussion segment, and then we will open up the floor to you, our audience, to participate in the Q&A by asking questions in our chat. Feel free to ask your questions in the chat box at any time as we begin to move through the presentations and on to the Q&A, and we will try to get to your questions one by one as quickly as we can. And now, on to the introduction of our 3 panelists for this afternoon. Our first guest is Dr. Laura DeBettencourt, professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Education and program lead for the special education programs in the School of Ed. She has trained special educators for over 35 years, so she brings a lot of wisdom to today's conversation. Dr. DeBettencourt has co-authored several textbooks and written numerous articles related to the instruction of students with mild to moderate disabilities. And she was more recently awarded a Fulbright scholarship during the spring semester of 2018 in Budapest, Hungary. Next, we have Dr. Tamara Marder, Associate Professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Education for Applied Behavior, Analysis, Autism, and Severe Disabilities Programs. She is a licensed psychologist and a board-certified behavior analyst, having worked in the field of applied behavior since 1994, applied behavior analysis, since 1994, and having extensive experience working with children with developmental disabilities and families in a variety of settings, including schools, homes, and hospitals. And then last but not least today, we have with us Dr. Linda Carling, Associate Research Scientist at the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Linda Carling has been developing and delivering online and blended programs for over 2 decades. Dr. Carling leads the online teaching and learning team at the Johns Hopkins Center for Technology and Education, focusing on building and implementing professional development systems that impact general and special educators and early childhood providers alike. She is also the mother of an autistic child. So thank you and welcome to our special guests and panelists today. Let's get started. Laurie, why don't we begin with you? The floor is yours. Dr. DeBettencourt, you're on mute.
Thank you. It's clear that districts continue to have an obligation to provide a free, appropriate public education during COVID-19 to students with disabilities. Educators need to ensure that all students are learning. Disabilities and those without disabilities. This gap is even wider for students of color with disabilities. If educators wait until the world returns to normal to provide an education to students with disabilities, these students will fall even further behind, and special educators will struggle to help them make up for the lost time. Working together, families, schools, and communities must be flexible. They must communicate effectively and continue to educate students to the best of their ability. The actual number, if you look at the last bullet, roughly 1 million of these students live in poverty or rural areas, and they have a lack of access to the internet. But that number actually might be even higher because it's based on the availability of broadband, not if the families can afford the service. You go to slide 2. During this uncertain time, family-school collaboration is more essential than ever. Families and educators are dealing with new challenges and stressors. Everyone's situation will be different. Meaningful and clear communication and collaboration between parents and schools can go a long way towards solving problems. Innovation while school buildings are closed will help us all avoid disagreements when they reopen. School districts should develop a protocol to communicate proactively with parents and guardians regarding their child's IEP services during the closure, taking into consideration the parent's preferred method of communication. The communication should be ongoing throughout the implementation of the plan so that the educators delivering and overseeing the services can make adjustments. The next slide. Districts must continue to meet and develop the IEPs within 30 days of the child's eligibility determination and at least annually thereafter. However, IEPs cannot be conducted face-to-face, so they have to be done in a different format, virtually. So the teachers really need to be trained in how to not only blend or provide instructional models online, but they need to know how to conduct virtual IEP meetings. They also need to know how to collect the data on how the child or children are progressing in these virtual settings. And they need to know how to collect and review and use the data online. There's many resources that have become available. We've put 2 links at the bottom of this slide for teachers, special educators, and general educators on how to do online lesson form planning. But the school district should also be providing opportunities and funding for online professional development. There is a national shortage of special educators. That goes without mentioning. But during this COVID situation and this crisis, this will probably affect the number of general and special educators who leave the field and the number who finish their training to become educators. It would be very good for school districts to think about partnering with higher ed institutions to create or strengthen that pipeline. Okay, next slide. All right, on to Tammy.
Thank you, Dr. Martyr.
Okay, I'm ready. Thanks so much for inviting me to join the conversation today. As mentioned, I am an associate professor at Johns Hopkins School of Ed, and I coordinate the Autism and Applied Behavior Analysis graduate programs. That's in our special ed department. Our programs focus on training and preparing educators to improve learning outcomes for students with developmental disabilities and autism. This includes training educators on implementing evidence-based practices with fidelity and preparing special educators in the field of applied behavior analysis. I think we do need to acknowledge in this unprecedented time that we are always learning and new questions arise every day. We definitely don't have all the answers as we navigate this new reality, specifically in special education. We should, though, rely on what we do know and the evidence that we do have about what works, and rely on our known strategies for how to best teach students with special needs. This is our evidence-based practices and strategies. During this time, we need to always come back to what we already know to best support students with special needs. Dr. DeBentoncourt provided a great outline of what training and resources schools should be providing to support special educators. I want to switch gears just a little bit and discuss planning for when students do go back to school. It's safe to say that the way that we provide supports in the classroom is going to change when we're back in the classroom, especially for students serving especially in classrooms serving students with special needs. From how we set up our classrooms, setting up schedules, how instruction is provided, and what the classroom environment looks like. We don't know right now when schools are going to reopen, And the conversation and resources seem to be focused on how to provide better teaching online, and that's super important right now. I think we should also be considering what our classrooms will look like when schools do open up and students are back in the classroom. In whatever capacity that might look like, the question is how can we prepare for in-classroom teaching now? So let's spend a few minutes talking about preparing for in-classroom teaching for our students with intensive educational and behavioral needs. Next slide, please. So let's first discuss some considerations for getting back into the special ed classroom. A question to consider is how to support the transition back to the school building and in the classroom. The move back to the school building will be a big transition for students. They'll need to get back into routine of being in school, getting up in the morning, getting dressed, having breakfast, so forth. It will also be a big transition for those families as well as our teachers. We need to be patient with routines. We should remember there will always be a different level of demand on our students. And remember that our students and teachers have been out of school routine most likely for 5 months or even more. The demands, instructions, and activities will most likely be an increase from previous weeks and months. For example, remembering how to follow old routines at school, learning new routines, additional routines that weren't part of the classroom setting when it was initially closed, like wearing masks, cleaning routines, and other hygiene activities. We need to ease into those new demands and instructions when students are back in the classroom.
Uh-oh. I'm frozen. No. Okay. So it looks like Dr. Martyr is frozen. So while we try to get her back to the conversation, we're going to move ahead and have Dr. Carling, and then we will try to finish up with Dr. Martyr if we can loop her back in. Thank you for your patience. Dr. Carling?
Thank you. So unfortunately, the worst consequences of this pandemic are being experienced by our most vulnerable students. You know, there's the psychological impact that's very real. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty here with this, fear of sickness, there's stress, there's stressors at home as well. Just a lot of uncertainty. When we discuss special education, we need to start by acknowledging that learners and their families rely on school as a place to learn and socialize and build their knowledge, and for many, you know, even meals and health services as well. Social and emotional learning is a significant area of development that takes place in school, where children learn to express themselves and, you know, manage their behavior, manage their emotions, demonstrate empathy, form friendships with peers. And, you know, we know that school promotes the health and well-being of a student's whole self. And, you know, all these things do impact academics as well. We all kind of experience or live through a school building closure across the United States that affected as much as, you know, 30% of the school year. And districts are planning on how to move forward this fall. And, you know we have a health and safety issue. It's a real concern. And we also know that we have students with disabilities that depend on supports that we can't replicate online. You know, I've been an educator for decades. Also, as Annette said, I'm a parent of a child who receives special education services. I have a third grade son who's autistic. He has some learning and attention challenges, and he's got some physical motor challenges as well. So it's very real for me as a parent, and it's been very challenging. You know, by law, you know, for the IEP, you know, services must be provided. It was included in the IEP, and the I stands for individualized, and that's important because each student is unique and each student has unique needs. You know, there's a lot of concerns that I've had that I've discussed with teachers and my child's IEP team, and things that I've heard other families and teachers say, things like, you know, concern my child's going to continue to lag behind when there's already that gap. There's, you know, losing skills that were very hard earned. I mean, there are skills that we spent 1 or 2 years developing that, you know, social skills and things like that are going to be very difficult if they're lost. You know, engagement in a virtual class. My son struggles with group group participation. That's a real challenge. Distance learning is not an ideal format for him. And I'm juggling work. I'm a full-time, I have a career. My husband has a career, and I have multiple children, and it's just really been difficult, and it will continue to be. So we're all kind of bracing ourselves, figuring out how to make everything work, and how to give, how do I give my son the services and supports that he needs so that he doesn't continue to fall behind and we can keep moving. There's also children who have more significant needs. There's children, for example, who communicate through physical interaction. There's children who live in households where another language is the primary language. And, then the technology considerations that were mentioned is a big piece, the access. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's where really creativity counts here. It's critical to I encourage school districts and teams to look at things creatively for how we can support our kids. I've seen parents and teachers become closer than ever. I've never communicated with teachers more than I have during those past 13 weeks. I've seen teachers working really, really hard. And this is a time, as Lori said, this is a time to do professional development for teachers. This is a time for teachers to become leaders. Can you go to the next slide, please? This is the time for teachers to have have paths of leadership. This is time to really look at how we can truly differentiate instruction. Now I can see what my child is able to do. I've been able, working closely with him, I see things that I may have not seen before. So there are some opportunities here that we have the means to really think creatively and look at. And assessment's really key. I'm seeing a lot of, assessment kinds of things overlooked. I really want to make sure that we're still assessing, even if kids are not meeting face-to-face, that we do continue to find ways to understand what their strengths and needs are, and where, especially more than ever, given what's been going on. So school districts are, legally required to provide students with FAPE, free and appropriate public education. And now we're moving to a different school format. So it's now determining, what is provided to a student with a disability that needs support for this format, or if there's a case where a student cannot learn through virtual learning. And so that's where that creativity comes in, and something to really plan for now with the IEP team. Even if it's something that, even if the school district hasn't made a decision yet, it's now a good time to be asking those questions. So to the next slide, please. So here are some questions to think about for educators and families when planning now and planning in the near future, ahead for how we can support with whether it's a virtual option or a hybrid option, without, as the schools are going. So challenges and lessons learned from virtual learning. We've learned a lot already. This is a time to pause and reflect and, see what works and what's not working. How will goals be accomplished? So even starting with, a couple goals to start. How are, how's progress measured? And, what's the communication plan with the parent? And this should be weekly communication. What specially designed instruction will be provided to the learner? And what combinations, can be replicated at home? What was used in the classroom that can also be used home? And those may change over time. And that's important for families to remember, that things can change. If it's not working, meet with the team again and make some changes. And just lots of communication between families and providers are very important. Okay. And then the social emotional piece is also important. There's a question here of how will the learner form a positive, trusting relationship with the teacher? And I worded it that way specifically because we know the teachers are going to start the school year trying lots of activities and strategies to get to know students. If you're in a situation where your child might be working with a different teacher, for example, or teachers you're working with students you don't know very well, and you may feel confident you've done that as a teacher, but from personal experience, if a child doesn't have that bond with that teacher, it's going to be very hard to move past that, especially virtually. So that's really important to look from the lens of the child to see if they're able to build that relationship with the teacher. Again, the social emotional needs more than ever needs to be at the forefront, whether, looking at the individual child, but even have school districts look at schools and district-wide at assessing the social emotional needs of kids. There may be some interventions or other things could be able to be put in place for kids during this time. That's important as well. And how can we involve the family to understand the service delivery plan, to be involved in that, for example, and what resources and supports will the family need? So, not making assumptions that a family can do something or can't do something or will or won't. That's why these conversations are really important to have now. Even if there's an activity that virtually a family member is doing with the child and the teacher's observing virtually, that's a way to involve the family in this as well. Just, again, the creativity is important. So kind of my advice to families, just to summarize, would be to reach out to the IEP team and kind of looking ahead at your child, discussing your child's particular needs and what services would be helpful to them given the situation that we're in and all that we've learned thus far. Next slide. This just is some information about our center. So if you want to connect more or learn more, you can follow us here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carling. So we're still trying to get Dr. Martyr back, but as we are
Dr. Martyr's there. She's back.
Is she back?
I am back.
Oh, you're back. Great, great, great. Good to see you back. Thank you.
Sure.
So, did you want to finish up your slides before I go to the questions?
Sure, I would love to. We're talking about important considerations. That's where we should be talking about, because I was about to talk about prompting procedures, and I apologize for my glitchy internet access, but I'm glad that it worked out and I'm back. So talking about prompting procedures, we have to consider how those might change when we're back in the classroom setting, especially with safety precautions in schools. So for example, if social distancing is required in schools, how do we need to alter our prompting procedures? Are we going to be able to use hand-over-hand prompting? Will our verbal prompting be changed by wearing masks or social distancing? What alterations can we make? Prompting procedures are one of our evidence-based strategies. We know that it helps us in guiding our students' learning, so how do we need to alter them? With online learning, teachers no doubt have learned how to make alterations for prompting, which should be able to help guide them in how to alter in-person prompting as well. Finally, thinking about our safety measures, we also have to consider how our behavior intervention plans might change. First, a big consideration for returning to the classroom setting will be thinking about the function of our students' challenging behaviors. We can expect successful behavior plans in place before schools were shut down may not be needed or may need to be changed. With school closing, previously seen inappropriate behaviors may no longer be happening. Alternatively, being back in school, which means an increase in requirements, tasks, and demands that I mentioned previously, we could also see an increase in some challenging behaviors, or we may see totally new behaviors in students. So we need to consider, how do we go back to implementing behavior intervention plans as they were in prior to the shutdown of schools? We will need to conduct functional behavior assessments for previous challenging behaviors or new behaviors that might be happening. I recommend that we do plan to use behavior intervention plans as they were applied prior to the shutdown of schools and rely on our data to tell us if those behavior intervention plans are currently working or are no longer necessary, or if new functional behavior assessments are needed. Again, we should remember to use our basic reinforcement strategies for skill performance. Those behaviors we want to see in the classroom or school settings should continue, and we should rely on the strategies we know how to use successfully. Another consideration for behavior plans is each teacher's ability to successfully execute those plans. So it should be expected that our own fidelity with implementing behavior plans has also diminished. It's important to consider, just as our students have been out of practice with skills in the school setting, educator skills in respect to following the steps of behavior plans is also out of practice. So in preparation for getting back into the classroom, how can we increase training for personnel on correct implementation of each step of the behavior intervention plan? How can we ensure fidelity of those plans? Teachers and paraprofessionals can use role-playing and behavior skills training to practice the correct implementation of behavior plans with all classroom staff prior to the return of the school building. And on to my last slide, and I'll finish up. The discussions around all of these considerations for returning to schools and in-person learning can be overwhelming. Where should we start? How do teachers prepare for all the eventualities? In this last slide, let's take a few minutes to look at some practical solutions and resources for special educators. Given some of the considerations for being back in schools, what are some strategies special educators can do now to prepare for being back in the classroom? First, with the expected regulations of social distancing and wearing masks, teachers can begin thinking about how their classrooms will be organized. An environmental supports assessment can help teachers prepare for how to organize their classroom in the best possible way. The website PENT, which stands for Positive Environment Network of Trainers, provides many resources for organizing each classroom setting. Included in the consideration of how the classroom will be organized, teachers can identify now what some of those new routines might be when they return to the classroom. For example, the routine for cleaning up in the classroom, a routine for wearing a mask, transitions between activities in and out of the school or the classroom following social distancing. Teachers can determine now what those new routines might look like and develop skill acquisition plans to teach the new routines when students return to the classroom. Also, since teachers will rely on data in order to ensure a successful return to the classroom, teachers can begin preparing those data sheets now. The data sheets can be developed and based on new routines and skills that are going to be taught. Also, data sheets for behavior plans can be updated, and data sheets to track new behaviors can be developed so teachers are ready for any unexpected new behaviors that might occur. The Affirm modules provides a great module on functional behavior assessments and how to collect data on those behaviors. And then finally, as Dr. Carling probably discussed, and I think I might have missed it, collaborating with parents is the most important thing of all. I'm a parent and I have a lot of concerns for my own children returning to school. I know that I'm not alone in that concern. We also know teachers have many of the same concerns too. Collaboration between teachers and parents is very important. It is vital for teachers to hear the concerns of parents and to share with them all of the steps that they are taking to keep their children safe and experience a successful transition back to school. Working closely with parents on what a return to school will look like and what will be needed will help ensure a successful outcome for all students. The Affirm modules website has a wonderful COVID-19 toolkit which can help guide educators and parents alike. I'd like to add the Affirm modules, which is focused on autism, are resources that can be used by all special educators who serve different types of students with special needs. Again, thank you for your patience and my internet access, and that is all that I have.
Thank you, Dr. Martyr. We appreciate your tenacity, hanging in there. Thank you so much. So I see that many of our guests have started to post some questions in the chat. And while people are still formulating questions, we want to get to as many of those questions as possible. I'd just like to start with a couple questions that I have here. Dr. DeBettencourt, in what ways do you think that the school closures have exacerbated existing inequities for students with special needs?
I think in many cases, the special educators moved so quickly. They had to transition, as everyone did, transition to remote learning. And most of what special educators do with their particular children that they have on their caseload is dependent on how close they stand to the student, how much face-to-face interaction they have, and how they judge before a crisis comes, how they can kind of de-escalate the situation. And that's very difficult on Zoom. If the child can or cannot, can't access the Zoom to begin with due to social, emotional, or any other type of disability. So my hat's off to so many special educators who have really, all educators over this time. It's been emotional, it's been very difficult, and I think they're doing the best they can. But I think it's only going to make the disabilities the difference between those who can learn very easily to those that struggle with learning much more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And Dr. Carling, you gave us a very riveting and poignant reminder of how this is a personal story for so many families. including yours. Can you talk a little bit about what some of your concerns are as we start thinking about heading back to school in the fall, as you talked about some of the challenges you felt that your son had to face this spring?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was an adjustment. My son has a lot of school anxiety. He's one of those kids that has a lot of sensory challenges, and being in the school, he's in a general ed setting. He has an aide, and being in that setting is very challenging, just to him with all that's going on. But the social piece was really important, an area we focused on as part of his IEP. So when we moved on, and when we moved online, we had both positives and negatives, but the concern really, the negative was just getting the instruction. I found that it was very difficult for him to participate and stay in the pace of the lessons that were in there, the interaction with the chat and things like that. That there's a capacity building there that we have not done yet. There are skills that are not developed yet that may be typical. I don't, typical second graders may have, or I think all kids need a baseline of technology knowledge to be able to do this anyway, but especially to do it independently or even with a lot of support. So that was very difficult, and any type of group setting was very hard. The one-on-one, where he had one or two other kids there, were much, much better when they were tailored for him. And that is something that's going to have to be considered. And that's something that we have to discuss. I have to discuss with his teachers. Thankfully, I have a very strong relationship with my child's team, and they're very creative and open to working through things. So, but that took time to build.
Thank you, Dr. Carling. And Dr. Martyr, some schools have had a difficult time trying to meet the IEP requirements of their students. How should these schools then partner with families to think about compensatory services in the time of a pandemic?
I think that's difficult. It's really hard to do. And again, collaboration is the key. So parents have schedules, right? Their own work schedules. Teachers have their own work schedules, and trying to collaborate amongst them. So the collaboration between the teachers and the parents to the schedule that works out best for everybody. I know that a lot of the teachers that I work with, who are also my graduate students, are really struggling with setting those times. They want to set boundaries, of course, but parents also have to work. So I think, again, just the more communication, as Dr. Carling was talking about, the more that you can have that communication between the teachers and the student, the teachers and the parents, the better the outcome is going to be for the student to support them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Martyr. So now I want to turn to some of the questions that we have in the chat. As a reminder, if any of our guests this afternoon have any questions, please post them in the chat. We will try to get to as many of these as we possibly can. So the first question asks about remote learning. How can you set up routines for children with special needs when they are in either a fully virtual or even a hybrid learning environment? How can we set up routines for them that can help them to maximize their success, their chances for success? Any of our guests can answer these questions.
I'll jump in real quick first and talk about some of the strategies we do know that help us setting up routines for our students, using things like visual schedules. Again, I can't stress enough collaboration between parents and teachers, but really looking at some of the resources we have, and I'm pretty sure in those Affirm modules that I talked about are different strategies for setting up visual schedules. I think that we can do this in any setting, virtual, hybrid, face-to-face, whatever it might be. And we can use anything from some of our learners who are not yet reading text, using pictures. We can also use text to do that. Students are pretty adept at using their own devices, so there's a lot of online schedules that we can provide, but I think that might be our first step, is looking at some of those schedules for setting up those routines.
I also think that most teachers, parents, and students operate best if they know what's going to happen ahead of time. And so setting up those schedules early every day or weekly and just going over them and over them, most kids feel most comfortable if they know what to expect.
Mm-hmm.
So any type of routine that any parent can put down at their house, and it may be different for every single family.
Right.
Yeah, just to echo that, I think just knowing that that it is different for different families. Yeah, the visual schedule's been a huge help. It's something I've used, and it's something that teachers may really reach out to families and may need to help them to set that up, to help them to provide rewards for the child when the child following to the next task and things like that, and breaking down the day. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So our next question is about the potential to homeschool. We are seeing district after district come out recently in the last few weeks to declare that for many of them, fall will be a return to virtual learning. So this question from Elisa asks, what would the panel recommend that school districts do to proactively work with families who are choosing to legally homeschool? What protocols would you endorse for quote unquote pausing IEPs rather than exiting children out of IEPs, since the student would be then unenrolling from the public school system? And how can schools get in front of the potential administrative nightmare that awaits us all in the fall of 2021 when we consider going back to school and having these special education families re-enroll? So there's a couple of different things in that question. One is, I see you all chomping at the bit to answer, which is great. We know that there are lots of families that are thinking about this right now. The potential for having a return to virtual learning for some families with children with special needs has meant that they're thinking about what their options are. Let's start with you, Dr. DeBettencourt, and then we'll go to you, Dr. Martyr, and then Dr. Carlin, you can close us out.
As a mom who had learning centers all over her house when my kids were younger, I will say homeschooling is certainly something a lot of parents are thinking about. But in terms of the law, I'll start there, and then the other two can talk about other things. In terms of the law, and it's a very good question. Children with disabilities have the right to receive educational services appropriate to their needs at the public's expense. And parents who choose to homeschool are waiving their right for their children, but may still be eligible for certain services through their local system. And I think it's a good way of the public schools. They should decide to educate the parents on what services, compensatory or extra services, therapeutic, social, emotional services, that their speech and language, for instance, that even though they are homeschooling at home, that they still are have available to them, as well as IDEA requires the public schools to identify those kids with disabilities and to provide an IEP for them. And the parents can consent to it or not consent, but the public is not then waived of their right to have to provide those services in the sense of identifying them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Martyr?
Again, I think I'll come back to the key word of collaboration between schools and parents in these situations. Really, I think one of the question was, how do they, if they go back to homeschooling, then how do they re-enroll? What are the protocols? And I think that school districts should be considering what some of those protocols might be. I don't know if I could answer that question right now, what those protocols might look like. That may be a whole nother panel discussion. But I do think that collaboration piece between parents and schools and school districts really providing some of that guidance on what protocols might look like. What might it look like if you decide to homeschool, and what might it look like if you come back? There's a lot of pieces in there and a lot of pieces to consider.
There are. Dr. Carlin?
Yeah, I think, from the family perspective, I think there are a lot of resources, parent resources, that can help parents think through that decision-making piece. And I think appreciate that Dr. DeBettencourt brought in the legal aspect, because that really, there is a legal piece to that. And, leaving with school districts deciding what support they would offer based on what, it's nice to have some type of continuity if you can, just to keep keeping those communication channels open. Yeah, with families.
And I just give one really good resource, just a shout out to it for parents to look at, is understood.org.
Okay. And so we'll try to get that into the chat as well. Thank you all. We have our next question from Katie, which is around assessment. And we know that that is a looming question for regular education as well as for special education. So Katie's question is, what are some assessment sources that might be useful for capturing baseline data? This is the ongoing question in education circles. Those of us in education are trying to figure out, how do we assess the learning that may have been lost? So as we think about students with special needs, what kinds of sources should we be looking to? Katie says, our district will be using MAP assessments for the majority of the population, but this approach might not be one size fits all for our students with some more significant learning needs. What should we be thinking about there? Any of our panelists have any insight there?
I have a great source for this for Katie. Katie, there's a National Center on Intensive Intervention, and they have put out just numerous podcasts and papers and links for exactly what we're going through right now for remote learning and assessment. So I highly recommend you go there, because they will show teachers, school districts, and parents what the issues are with assessment.
Thank you. Our next question is from A.M. Marcel. A.M. Marcel is interested in the panelists' perspectives on children with disabilities who have increased medical risk for attending school in person when school resumes in person, and thinking about how schools can manage continually the remote education of those children who may not be able to participate in person in their instruction. Any thoughts on that from the panelists?
I'll jump in. I think there definitely needs to be a plan, if I can say collaboration one more time. But I do think that there needs to be a plan for those students who are medically fragile, who probably should be social distancing and not in a school classroom. There needs to be a plan for those students. And again, this is another challenge for school districts to be thinking about, how do we best protect those students, because I think safety has to be first, but how can we address making sure that they can still do they can still access the remote learning and not be required to be in the classroom if their health is in jeopardy.
I do think this is going to be a bigger issue than we can possibly imagine, because there are a number of children that their parents are not going to want to send them in, either because they have a medical issue, or the family has a medical issue, or someone that's living with them has a medical issue that's at risk for COVID. And I think the schools are thinking about ways to address this. And it may be that if they decide to go back some way face-to-face, that there's also that hybrid option where parents can opt for that child to Zoom into the classroom rather than to come face-to-face. But these kids and these families need to be considered, because there's going to be a large percentage of people who choose not to go back because of the medical risk.
Okay.
I agree. I was going to add, I agree with that. The families, I'm part of large family communities, and yeah, there's a lot of families that are, for those reasons, are very concerned about sending back. So for school districts, I would absolutely plan on, probably more than you expect, being in this scenario and looking at how knowing that up front and getting that, not being surprised when you get those kinds of questions and requests, how to start planning now for supporting that.
Thank you. Our next question comes from a Baltimore City School Board Commissioner, Ronald McFadden. We're happy to see you in our conversation today. His question is, what are recommendations, and this could go to Dr. Martyr first, what recommendations do you have around implementing BIPs virtually? First, for our audience, could you unpack what BIPs are, and then also answer what kinds of recommendations you might make around virtual diagnostics? And what are some recommendations that you have about gathering behavioral data with limited physical interactions between our teachers and our students? This is a great question. Thank you, Dr. Martyr, for taking this first.
Yes, that's a big question. Remind me if I miss anything, Annette. I think the first, behavioral intervention plans are developed, our intervention plans to address behaviors that may interfere with learning in the classroom setting or at home. It doesn't have to just be within the classroom setting. And they are based on functional behavior assessment. So it's something that I was talking about during my slides, which really looks at understanding why the behavior occurs. And typically, a behavior gives us access to something or helps us avoid something we don't like. When we talk about challenging behavior. So the functional behavior assessment looks at that. Behavior intervention plans that are developed must be developed based on the function of the behavior. And again, it comes back to those evidence-based practices that I was mentioning prior to that really looks at addressing these challenging behaviors and how we can improve learning despite the challenging behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, how do we do that? Let me get that question right, Annette. How do we do that virtually?
Yes.
Yeah, good question.
There's recommendations for me.
Right. So I think that's a tough one. And it's something I am struggling with teaching my own graduate students on how to do that. I think that we have to alter some of those behavior plans. Again, I mentioned demands are different between home and school. We may not see some of those behaviors at home that we might be seeing at school because it's different types of demands. I think that we have to, again, work with families to modify or alter behavior intervention plans in the classroom, but teach in the home, but teachers are really limited because they cannot see everything. And so they can guide on what they know that works in the classroom and work collaboratively with parents to talk about how can we alter this? Like how can we present demands at home in a way that is similar to maybe how we did it at school or what works within school that works at home as well. The thing to also, I'm sorry, the thing to also remember is that those behaviors, if we're doing more school at home, right? Kids are like, wait, we don't do this at home. Why do I have to do all this work at home? This is where I have fun, which is where I enjoy life and hang out. That's also a different transition for students. And assessing that is a good question. I don't think I have the answer on that one. We were talking about with our graduate students, how do we have, we can't necessarily say have a temper tantrum in front of the computer right here on Zoom so that I can assess that behavior. That's not the way it works. It's not the way it can happen. One option, and there's a lot of issues with confidentiality on this that schools have to address, is setting up a videotape so parents can share with teachers what is happening at home when we are having those challenging behaviors prior to the behavior occurring. But again, we have to follow confidentiality on that. That's utmost importance. Families have to feel comfortable with that, have to sign waivers to agree to that. But that's one possible option to address assessing some of those behaviors that should be or could be explored.
I think if I could just add that what happened this spring has really changed our thinking about training for special educators. Special educators now need to know how to do BIPs virtually before they go out in the field. They need to know how to do virtual IEPs. They need to know how to teach online. And that's changing how we develop our program for pre-service teachers. And I think it's important for all training programs to start thinking about this, because there are a lot of families who don't make it into school on a regular basis that need to understand what's happening with their child behaviorally and know how to assess that data at home. Not just the teachers need to know how to assess it, but the parents need to know how to assess it. And parents aren't trained teachers, so we need to be able to help those parents understand how to do it.
Great.
I want to add, can I add one more thing? Thinking about data collection, right, at home, because I was thinking, how can we evaluate if what we're doing, if what we're guiding parents on with behavior intervention plans at home. And Dr. Carling, you can maybe add to this your thoughts on that. I think that as teachers, we also have to consider, we can't just send home the data sheet and be like, oh, just collect this data on these different behaviors. That is definitely not going to happen. And because parents have jobs and they have other things that they need to be doing, they can't be collecting data like we might do in a classroom setting. So really whittling down what's the most important piece on that data sheet, if it's maybe one behavior, and looking at the different ways that we collect behavior data. There's lots of different options there, and teachers should be able to guide parents on how to collect that data in home so that it's not all the behaviors, but maybe one, and maybe during a specific time of day.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to add that one piece in thinking about assessing behaviors in the home setting or virtually.
Great.
Yes, it is very hard to collect data on a regular basis using data sheets. I found I found that very challenging, and I can create data sheets. So yes, it's definitely difficult. I totally agree with Dr. Marr. I think that makes sense. Starting focusing on the most critical pieces, and parents are experts on their kids, but they also want to help as much as they can and be a part of things they can. But just building their capacity over time will make a big difference in the long run for sure.
Great.
Small steps and building on will be great.
Okay, thank you. Moving forward, we have a question from Molly Evans about early childhood and special education. Do you recommend any resources to support young children with disabilities for distance learning? Know of anything? I think my recommendation, I know that the center, we have an Ideal Center in the School of Education that's run by Dr. Chris Swanson. And if you can get onto the School of Education webpage and find that Ideal's website, he's got so many COVID resources for early childhood. And I'm sure that there also will be some resources there to address early childhood and special education.
I was going to mention Chris Swanson as well. His group is doing some great work, and it's available on the website under the Ideals, IDEALS Center.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Tia Feather. And this is one I think a lot of parents have been thinking about. How do you recommend managing mask compliance for students with special needs? But I think all parents are trying to think about mask compliance in school for 6.5 hours.
Make it fun.
I was actually
make it fun, make it pretty.
I actually, as I was preparing for this panel, I looked up task analysis for mask wearing. There are some really great resources out there. So if you just Google task analysis mask wearing, you can find some good resources. I kind of debated putting in that resource onto my slide. That's why I put the one slide for the Affirm modules on how to create a task list. I think the American Association for Pediatrics also has something on their website about how to get your child to wear a mask, even young children. So I think, again, Dr. Carling just said it with regards to parents building on with data collection and building up. It's the same thing with masks. So, increasing some pairing activities between masks and fun stuff, and taking small steps to and reinforce that mask wearing. Maybe it's just putting it on your face for 5 seconds, and then, some fun stuff to do after that. So looking at that task analysis module will help sort of breaking down. And I think most people could put together a task analysis on how to wear a mask.
Great. We've got just a few more minutes. I'm going to try to get a few last questions in. Linda Starnes has a question about hospital and homebound service, because some parents don't have a choice about back to school if their child has a chronic or complex medical need. Should parents be thinking about trying to enroll their children in a homebound service if that's more appropriate than trying to return to a hybrid or an online version?
I think a lot of these decisions should be based on the IEP and what the goals and objectives are of that child and what their needs are. And then the decision should be made by the multidisciplinary team. And the decision should be made in terms of placement based on where the best place is to make sure that child meets their needs. So it's not quite a straight line to medical care needed to homebound or hospital service. It really should be a conversation that you have based on the long-term and short-term goals that your child has.
Thanks. Anyone else? Okay, I have another question, which I think is almost the flip of that. And this is a question from an anonymous attendee that asks, what about bringing students with special needs back into the school campus during the school closure. So we've talked about the school being more than a physical space for just regular education instruction, but is it possible to think about how we can open up our school campuses for those students with special needs to get their services in a socially distanced way on the campus?
So if I'm understanding that, do they mean the higher ed campus?
No, bringing students with special needs back to school, and
I-
only those children, while the rest of the children continue to learn virtually. Those in
I
regular.
think some school districts are looking at that because it's been so difficult for them to meet the needs of their identified students with special needs. And I think each school district is going to have to make that decision on their own as to whether or not that's possible. I don't think it's any easier because they're identified as kids with special needs. All the same questions are there in terms of safety and making sure that they're not, the COVID isn't transferred from the kids to the teachers or the teachers to the kids. So I understand this question, and I think it's going to depend on how the school districts decide. I don't think it's an easy answer.
Yeah.
Can I add also, I think, you know, when we talk about like what other supports can we provide, because there are kids that distance learning is not going to work as a means for instruction, and you know, bringing students with disabilities to school or having some type of in-person, if it's safely done, and if it's something that, again, you know, I agree with Dr. Betancourt, depends on the district, depends on the situation. If the district's deciding to close and there are services open in the area, I mean, it might be worth looking into. You know, again, it's not an easy answer, and safety is really, really important, health and safety. But if there are services, tutoring services or other types of services that are available, you know, depending on where you live, I mean, those could be options for school districts to support students with disabilities in this situation, if you need that.
Great.
Just thinking creatively about other opportunities.
So just in the interest of time, this is going to be our last question. There have been so many good questions. There's still so many good questions in the chat that I want to ask, but I know that we are held to an hour. Our final question comes from Joyce Clark. If students are homeschooled, and we just need a very quick answer from our panel, what are the legal ramifications for lost progress? And can parents hold schools accountable if there is lost progress? That will be our final question today.
I'll go back to the IEP. If parents don't sign the IEP and then determine that they want to homeschool their child, then there's less accountability required from the school. But the school still has to offer the IEP services to them, and then there's a line on the IEP that says that I choose not to have my child take part in this. But there's many legal websites out there that will provide more detail with that.
Okay, thank you. Any final thoughts from our other two panelists as we close our Q&A?
I'd just like to say that this is really hard for the teachers. I think they miss their kids. I think they miss the opportunity to help, especially the kids with disabilities, because they are so vulnerable in so many ways and they're already behind. And I think we're realizing how important teachers are, all teachers are, and I'm hoping that on the other side of this, that communities recognize this and maybe support teacher training more, or maybe support teachers more. Right now, teachers make very close to the poverty line, and I'm hoping that this will cause us to rethink this whole process about educators and how important they are. I think parents who are working from home, who miss those teachers taking care of their children who are also at home, would agree with me.
Yes. Well, as the daughter of a special educator, I want to thank this esteemed panel for your hard work today, bringing us this information and for allowing us to tap into your areas of expertise around special education. I want to thank our wonderful audience. These have been wonderful questions, and I wish that we had more time to get to all of the questions that were in the chat, but we've had a really great discussion. And I know that we're leaving this conversation with a lot to think about. I would again like to extend a special thank you to our seminar sponsors, including the Johns Hopkins School of Education, the Johns Hopkins Consortium for School-Based Health Solutions, the Berman Institute of Bioethics, and the Rail Center for the Integration of Health and Education. For those of you who have missed some of today's panel, you can see it on the Hopkins coronavirus page where it has been simulcast. So if you go to coronavirus.jhu.edu, you can see this in its entirety, which will be posted shortly. We want to say again a special thank you to the many members of our audience, several of you whom have come to all of these sessions, and we want to thank you for your participation in this webinar series as we prepare to reopen our schools in the fall. Be sure to tune in for our next webinar on school-based healthcare in the era of COVID-19. It will be next Monday, July 27th at 3 p.m. My name is Dr. Annette Anderson, and I want to just thank you for the opportunity to be your host for today. We look forward to hearing from you, and until next time, thank you for joining us. Have a great day. Bye-bye.